Chapter 1 of the Pianoforte Sonata by John South Shedlock. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Introductory. In history we find certain names associated with great movements. Luther with the Reformation or Garibaldi with the liberation of Italy. Luther certainly posted on the door of the church at Wittenberg his famous theses, and burnt the papal bull at the gates of that city, yet before Luther there lived men, such as the scholar Erasmus, who have been appropriately named reformers before the Reformation. So, too, Cavour's cautious policy paved the way for Garibaldi's brilliant victories. Once again Leonardo da Vinci is named as the inventor of chiaroscuro, yet he was preceded by Fra Filippo Lippi, and in similar manner in music certain men are associated with certain forms. Haydn, for example, is called the father of the quartet. Close investigation, however, would show that he is only a link, and certainly not the first one in a long evolution. So, too, with the sonata. The present volume is, however, specially concerned with the clavier or pianoforte sonata, and for that we have a convenient starting point. The sonata in B flat of Kuhnau, published in 1695. The date is easy to remember, for in that same year died England's greatest musician, Henry Purcell. Before studying the history of the pianoforte sonata, even in outline, it is essential that something should be said about the early history of the sonata. That term appears first to have been used in contradistinction to cantata. The one was a piece sounded, suonata from sonando, by instruments, the other one sung by voices. The form of these early sonatas, as they appear in Giovanni Gabrieli's work towards the end of the 16th century, was vague, yet, in spite of light imitations, the basis was harmonic rather than contrapuntal. They were among the first fruits of the Renaissance in Italy, but soon there came about a process of differentiation. Praetorius, in his Syntagma Musicum, published at Wolfenbüttel in 1619, distinguishes between the sonata and the canzona. Speaking generally, from one seems to have come the sonata proper, from the other the suite. During the whole of the 18th century there was a continual intercrossing of these two species. It is no easy matter, therefore, to trace the early stages of development of each separately. Marburg, in his description of various kinds of pieces in his Klavierstücke, published at Berlin in 1762, says sonatas are pieces in 3 or 4 movements, marked merely allegro, adagio, presto, etc., although in character they may be really an allemande, courante and gigue. Corelli, as will be mentioned later on, gave dance titles in addition to allegro, adagio, etc. Marburg also states that when the middle movement is in slow time, it is not always in the key of the first and last movements. This again shows intercrossing. The genuine suite consists of several dance movements, allemande, courante, sarabande, gigue, all in the same key. But we find occasionally in suites a fugue or fuguetta, or even an aria or adagio, and in name, at any rate, one dance movement has formed part of the sonata since the time of Emanuel Bach. In 1611, Banchieri, an Olivetan monk, published at Venice his L'organo suonerino, a work useful and necessary to organists, thus runs the title page. At the end of the volume there are some pieces, vocal and instrumental, a concerto for soprano or tenor, with organ, a fantastica, ricercata, etc., among which are to be found 2 sonatas, one entitled Prima Sonata, doppio soggetto, the other Seconda Sonata, soggetto triplicato. They are written out in open score of 4 staves, with mezzo-soprano, alto, tenor and bass clefs. To show how the sonatas of those days differed both in form and content from the sonata of our century, the first of the above mentioned is given in short score. It will, probably, remind readers of the first, i.e. sonatas, that my, i.e. Dr. Burney, musical inquiries have discovered, namely, some sonatas by Francesco Torini, which consisted of only a single movement in fugue and imitation throughout. Torini was organist of Brescia Cathedral and in 1624 published Madrigali a una, due, tre voci con alcune sonate e a tre, Venice 1624. Between Torini, also Carlo Farina, who published violin sonatas at Dresden in 1628, and Corelli, born 1653, who brought out his first work in 1683, one name of great importance is Giovanni Legrenzi. In the 8th volume of Dr. Burney's musical extracts there are two sonatas, a tre a due violini e violone by Legrenzi, opera ottava, 1677. The first is in B flat. It commences with a movement in common time entitled La Benivoglia. An adagio in G minor, only 6 bars, is followed by an allegro in D minor, 6/8 time, closing on a major chord, then 8 bars common time in B flat, no heading, and finally a presto, 3/4, commencing in G minor and closing in B flat. None of the movements is in binary form. The second sonata in D has 5 short movements. Number 1 has an opening of 37 bars in common time, fugato. There is a modulation in the 9th bar to the dominant and, later on, a return to the opening theme and key. In the intervening space, however, in spite of modulation, the principal key is not altogether avoided. Sonatas of various kinds by Legrenzi appeared between 1655 and 1677. Then there were the Vari fiori del giardino musicale uero sonate da camera, etc. of Giovanni Maria Bononcini, father of Battista Bononcini, the famous rival of Handel, published at Bologna in 1669, and the sonatas of Giovanni Battista Vitali, Bologna 1677. Giambattista Bassani of Bologna, although his junior by birth, was the violin master of the great Corelli. His sonatas only appeared after those of his illustrious pupil, yet may have been composed before. Of the 12 in opus 5, most have many short movements, some indeed are so short as to be scarcely deserving of the name. By the time of Arcangelo Corelli, who, as mentioned, published his first work, opus 1, 12 sonatas for 2 violins and a bass, in 1683, sonatas answered to the definition given by Mattheson in his Das neue Offnete Orchester, 1713, in which they are said to consist of alternate adagio and allegro. G. J. Walther again in his Dictionary of Music, which appeared in Leipzig in 1732, describes a sonata as a grave artistic composition for instruments, especially violins. The idea of grouping movements was already in vogue in the 16th century. Morley in his Plain and Easy Introduction to Practical Music, published in 1597, speaks of the desirableness of alternating pavans and galliards, the one being a kind of staid music ordained for grave dancing, and the other a lighter and more stirring kind of dancing. Contrast was obtained, too, not only by difference in the character, but also in the measure of the music. The former was in common, the latter in triple time. With regard to the grouping of movements, Corelli's sonatas show several varieties. The usual number, however, was 4, and the order generally slow fast slow fast. Among the 48, opus 1, 2, 3 and 4, published 1685, 1690, 1694 and 1700 respectively, we find the majority in 4 movements, in the order given above. Footnote: among the 4 movement sonatas in opus 1, number 6, in B minor, has the peculiar order grave, largo, adagio, allegro. End of footnote. Of the 12 in opus 3, no less than 11 have 4 movements, but number 1, in F, has grave, allegro, vivace, allegro. Number 6, in G, vivace, grave, allegro, allegro. Number 10, in A minor, vivace, allegro, adagio, allegro. There are, however, 8 sonatas consisting of 3 movements, and this, a century later, became the normal number. We will give the list. Opus 1, number 7, in C. Allegro, grave, allegro. Middle movement begins in A minor but ends in C. Opus 2, number 2, in D minor. Allemande, adagio. Corrente, allegro. Giga, allegro. Opus 2, number 6, in G minor. Allemande, largo. Corrente, giga. Opus 2, number 9, F sharp minor. Allemande, largo. Tempo di serrabanda, largo. Giga, allegro. Opus 4, number 8, D minor. Preludio, grave. Allemande, allegro. Sarabanda, allegro. Opus 4, number 10, G. Preludio. Footnote: the Preludio Adagio only consists of 4 chords, or 2 bars. The Adagio, again, only consists of 4 bars. The sonata, therefore, may be considered as of 3 movements. End of footnote. Adagio and Allegro. Adagio and grave, E minor. Tempo di gavotta, allegro. Opus 4, number 11, C minor. Preludio, largo. Corrente, allegro. Allemande, allegro. Opus 4, number 12, B minor. Preludio, largo. Allemande, presto. Giga, allegro. It is interesting to note that each of the 2 sonatas, opus 1, number 7 and opus 4, number 10, most in keeping with the title of sonata, has the middle movement in a relative key. Opus 1, number 7, begins with an allegro in common time, and the short grave is followed by a light allegro in 6/8 time. The first movement, with its marked return to the principal key, is very interesting in the matter of form. The other sonatas with suite titles have all their movements in the same key. Locatelli in his 12 sonate for flute, published early in the 18th century, has in the first Andante, Adagio, Presto, also numbers 3, 5, etc. So too in Tartini's sonatas, opus 1, there are also some in 3, number 3, etc. But Emanuel Bach commenced with that number, to which, with few and unimportant exceptions, he remained faithful. Likewise to the slow movement dividing the 2 quick ones. The 3-movement form used by J.S. Bach for his concertos and sonatas no doubt considerably influenced his son, but already, in 1668, Diedrich Becker, in his Musikalische Frühlingsfrüchte, wrote sonatas for violins, etc., and continuo in 3 movements, number 10, Allegro, Adagio, Allegro. Again, Sonata 19 opens with a movement in common time, most probably an allegro, then comes an adagio, and lastly a movement in 6/4, most probably quick tempo. These sonatas of Becker, a 3, 4 or 5, with basso continuo, are unfortunately only printed in parts. As a continuing link between the Gabrielis and Corelli, and more particularly as a forerunner of Kuhnau, Becker is of immense importance. We are concerned with the clavier sonata, otherwise we should certainly devote more space to this composer. we have been able to trace back sonatas by German composers to Becker, 1668, and by Italian composers to Legrenzi, 1655, those of Gabrieli and Banchieri as short pieces, not a group of movements, are not taken into account. Now, of earlier history, we do know that Hans Leo von Hassler, said to have been born at Nuremberg in 1564, studied first with his father, but afterwards at Venice, and for a whole year under A. Gabrieli. Italian and German art are thus intimately connected, but what each gave to or received from the other with regard to the sonata seems impossible to determine. The Becker sonatas acquired at Hamburg, and surely E. Bach must have been acquainted with them. Becker in his preface mentions another Hamburg musician, a certain Johann Schopp, who did much for the cause of instrumental music. Schopp, it appears, published concertos for various instruments already in the year 1644, and there was still another work of importance published in Amsterdam very early in the 18th century by the famous violinist and composer G. Torelli, which must have been known to E. Bach. It is entitled Six sonates au concert à 4, 5 et 6 parties, and of these 5 have 3 movements, Allegro, Adagio and Allegro. Corelli was the founder of a school of violin composers of which Gemmianini (1680 1762), Locatelli (1693 1764), Veracini (1685 1750). Veracini is regarded as of the Corelli school, yet it should not be forgotten that his uncle, Antonio Veracini, is said to have published Sonate a 3 violini e violone o archiluto col basso continuo prologano at Florence, already in 1662, and Tartini, (1692 1770), were the most distinguished representatives. The first 2 were actually pupils of the master. In the sonatas of these men there is an advance in 2 directions. Sonata form (it is important to distinguish between sonata and sonata form). The first movement of a modern sonata is usually in sonata form, but there are sonatas (Beethoven, Opus 26, etc.) which contain no such movement. Sonata form, as will be shown later on, has been evolved from old binary form. By sonata is understood merely a group of movements, hence objection may certainly be taken to the term as applied to the one movement pieces of Domscarlatti, which are not even in sonata form. Is in process of evolution from binary form, i.e. the second half of the first section is filled with subject matter of more definite character, the bars of modulation and development are growing in number and importance, and the principal theme appears as the commencement of a recapitulation. We should like to say that binary is changing into ternary form. Unfortunately, however, the latter term is used for a very different kind of movement. To speak of a movement in sonata form containing 3 sections, exposition, development and recapitulation, as in binary form, seems a decided misnomer. The violinists just mentioned were the last great writers of sonatas in Italy. Emanuel Bach arose during the first half of the 18th century, and henceforth Germany took the lead. Bach was followed by Haydn, Mozart and Beethoven. The influence of the Corelli It must be remembered that Corelli spent some time in Germany between 1680 and 1683, the latter being the year of publication of his first sonatas at Rome. School was felt in Germany and also in England. Sonatas were published by Veracini at Dresden in 1721 and by Tartini and Locatelli at Amsterdam before 1740. Again Veracini was for some time a solo violinist to the Elector of Dresden (1720 23). Tartini lived for 3 years at Prague (1723 26), while Locatelli, during the first half of the 18th century, made frequent journeys throughout Germany. Emanuel Bach, the real founder of the modern pianoforte sonata, must have been influenced by their works. In a history of the development of the sonata generally, those of Corelli would occupy an important place, for in them we find not only fugal and dance forms, but also hints of sonata form. Dr. Parry, in his article on Sonata in Sir G. Grove's Dictionary of Music and Musicians, has named the currente of Corelli's fifth sonata in Opus 4 as offering nearly a miniature of modern binary form. The well-known Giga Allegro of the ninth sonata, Opus 5, and the Allemande Allegro of the 10th concerto in C also present remarkable foreshadowings. Handel, however, furnishes a very striking illustration. In the six sonatas or trios for two hautboys with a thorough bass for the harpsichord, said to have been completed already in 1696, we find quick movement in binary form. In some, the first section offers both a first and a second subject, while in the second section, after modulation, there is a return to the opening theme, though quite at the close of that section. A brief description of one will make the form clearer. The second allegro of number 4 in F has two sections. The first, which ends in the dominant key, C, has 46 bars. The opening theme begins thus: A. At the 29th bar, a passage leads to the second theme, B. This second theme is, in a measure, evolved from the first. In any case, it is of subordinate character, and it differs slightly as given by first or second oboe, whereas the principal theme appears in exactly the same manner for both instruments. The second section opens with developments of B and modulation from C major to D minor. A is also developed, the music passing from the last named key back to the opening one. There is a full close in that key, and then modulation to F. The remaining 22 bars give the first section in condensed form, first and second subjects and coda. Footnote: in J.S. Bach's second sonata for flauto traverso and cembalo, third movement, there is a return to the opening theme in the second section. Also in the presto of the sonata for two violins and figured bass, we have an example very similar to the hautboy sonata of Handel. End of footnote. It would be interesting to trace the influences acting on the youth Handel at the time when he wrote these sonatas. Most probably they were Johann Philipp Krieger's footnote. Krieger, by the way, studied under Bernardo Pasquini at Rome. End of footnote. Sonatas for violin and bass. N.A. Strunk's sonatas published at Dresden in 1691, and more especially Agostino Stefani's Sonata a Camera for two violins, alto and bass, published in 1683. An opera by the last named, which appeared at Hanover in 1699, has an air de ballet, which contains the first notes of Let the Bright Seraphim. Besides, it is known that Handel culled ideas and "conveyed" notes from works of other composers, also that he turned them to the best account. In the same year in which Corelli published his Opus 1, 1683, Domenico Scarletti, the famous harpsichord player, was probably born. In the history of development his name is the principal one of importance between Corelli and Emanuel Bach. In the matter of technique he rendered signal service, but for the moment we are concerned with his contribution towards development. Scarlatti does not seem to have ever considered the sonata in the sense of a work consisting of several contrasting movements. All of his are of only one movement. The title sonata as applied to his piece is therefore misleading. Whether the term was actually used by the composer himself seems doubtful. The first 30 of the 60 Scarlatti sonatas published by Breitkopf and Hartel appear during the lifetime of the composer at Madrid. They are dedicated to John the Just, King of Portugal, and are merely entitled Esercizi per clavicembalo. In editions of the 18th century the composer's pieces are styled lessons or suites. However, 12 published by J. Johnson, London, are described on the title page as Sonatas Modernas. From the earliest days of instrumental music, dance tunes were divided into two sections. The process of evolution is interesting. In the earliest specimens, such as the Branle given in the orchestrographie of Thoinot Arbeau, We find both sections in the same key, and there is only one theme. The movement towards the dominant note in this branle may be regarded as a latent modulation. In time the first section was developed and the latent modulation became real. Then, after certain intermediate stages, the custom was established of passing from the principal to the dominant key, or in a minor piece, to the relative major or dominant minor, in which the first section closed. But in Corelli (footnote: compare Corelli, Currente in 10th Sonata of Opus 2, also Allemande and Giger of the next sonata), or even Scarlatti (footnote: compare Scarlatti, No. 10 of the 60 sonatas published by Breitkopf and Hartel), we find occasionally a return to an earlier stage, i.e. a first section ending in the same key in which it commenced. In most of his pieces Scarlatti modulates to the dominant, in minor to the relative major. Some exceptions deserve mention. In the Breitkopf and Hartel collection, No. 26 in A major passes to the minor key of the dominant, and No. 11 in C minor modulates to the minor key of the dominant, but the section closes in the major key of the dominant. Scarlatti's sonatas consist, then, of one movement in binary form of the early type. Only in a few of these pieces is there a definite second subject, in none a return to the opening theme. In No. 26 there is just a return to the first bar, see second section, bar 11. But the previous 10 bars show no modulation, and one can scarcely speak of thematic development. After a few bars of development and modulation, in some cases, the second section is found to consist merely of a repetition of some part of the first section, the key being tonic instead of dominant. This is, practically, embryonic sonata form. The tonic and dominant portions of the first section are becoming differentiated, but the landmark, i.e. the return to the opening theme in the second section which divides binary from sonata form, is, in Scarlatti, non-existent. His first sections also consist of a principal theme and passages, also phrases indirectly connected with the opening one, sometimes a chain of short phrases more or less evolved from the opening thought. See numbers 1, 21, 29. These and the numbers which follow refer to the Breitkopf and Hartel edition of 60 Scarlatti sonatas. The composer often passes through the minor key of the dominant in the first section before arriving at the major. Sometimes the major is introduced only late into the section, numbers 7, 17, etc., or minor remains, number 26. We meet with a similar proceeding in Beethoven. Minor pieces often pass to the dominant minor but end in major, i.e. first section. In Scarlatti there is, for the most part, no second subject, but frequently, numbers 5, 7, 9, etc., a concluding phrase which can at times be traced to the opening theme. Sonata 6 in F shows a second subject of a certain independence. The best examples are to be found in numbers 24 and 29 in A and E. In these the character of the second subject differs from that of the first, and it is also in a minor key, which offers still another contrast. And now a word or two respecting Scarlatti's methods of development. He alters figures, No. 12 and 54, extends them, numbers 9 and 54, but often merely repeats passages on the same degrees as those of the first section or in different ones. He makes use of imitation, numbers 7 and 36. Sometimes he evolves a phrase from a motive, No. 11. In No. 19 the development assumes a certain importance. It commences, not, as in most cases, with the opening theme or figure of the first section, but with a group of semi-quaver notes which appears later in that section. In No. 20 Scarlatti preserves the rhythm, but with total change of notes, No. 20. The same number gives another interesting specimen of change of rhythm. In No. 48 he picks out an unimportant group of notes and works it by imitation and sequence. There are some interesting specimens of development in the 30 sonatas printed from manuscripts in the possession of Lord Viscount Fitzwilliam by Robert Burchell. Scarlatti's development bars are seldom many in number. After modulation and development the music slides, as it were, into some phrase of the first section. Footnote: when there is clearly a second subject, that of course offers the point of return. See Nos. 24 and 39. End of footnote. And allowance being made on account of difference of key, there the music was passing or had passed from tonic, here it is returning to that key, the rest is more or less a repetition of the first section. More or less, sometimes the repetition is literal, at other times there is considerable deviation, and shortenings are frequent. With regard to style of writing for the clavier, a few canonical imitations excepted, there is no real polyphony. Most of the sonatas are in only two parts. The composer revels in rapid passages, runs, broken chords, simple and compound, wide leaps, difficult octaves, crossing of hands and, of course, short shakes innumerable. Domenico Scarlatti was indeed one of the most renowned virtuosi on the clavier. Handel met him at Rome in 1708 and Cardinal Ottoboni persuaded them to compete with each other. We are told that upon the harpsichord the victory was doubtful, but upon the organ Scarlatti himself confessed the superiority of his rival. Johann Kuhnau published a sonata for clavier in 1695, and this was followed up by a set of 7 sonatas, Frische Fruchte, in 1696, and a few years later, 1700, by the 7 Bible sonatas. That he was the first composer who wrote a sonata for the clavier is a point that cannot be overlooked, and in the evolution of the sonata he occupies an interesting position. In the Frische Fruchte there is, as C. H. Parry truly remarks in his excellent article Sonata, in Sir G. Grove's Dictionary of Musical and Musicians, an awakening sense of the relation and balance of keys, but in the Bible sonatas the form and order of the movements is entirely determined by the Bible stories. As specimens of programme music they are altogether remarkable, and will later on be described in detail. They do not, however, come within the regular line of development. It was, of course, natural that such a new departure should attract the notice of John Sebastian Bach, who was Kuhnau's immediate successor as cantor of St. Thomas's School, Leipzig, and Spitta, in his Life of Bach, refers to that composer's Capriccio sopra la lontananza del suo fratello dilettissimo, and reminds us that Kuhnau, as well as so many others, had some influence on Bach. Of course, among the "so many others," Froberger's name, as we shall see later on from Kuhnau's preface, deserves a prominent place. In addition to what Kuhnau says, Mattheson has recorded that Froberger could describe whole histories on the clavier, giving a representation of the persons present and taking part in them, with all their natural characters. When writing the Capriccio above named, Spitta believes that Bach was specially influenced by the last of the Bible sonatas. We may perhaps add that Spitta tells us that Bach was intimately acquainted with Kuhnau. He indeed says, we might doubt the early origin of the Capriccio if its evident dependence on Kuhnau did not solve the mystery. Then, again, in a sonata in D by Bach, published in the Bach Gesellschaft edition, Spitta calls attention to the opening subject in D and does not hesitate to declare that it is constructed on the pattern of a certain part of the story of Jacob's marriage, the third of the Bible sonatas. His description of the Bach sonata would, doubtless, have attracted more notice but for the fact that copies of the Kuhnau sonatas were extremely rare. They were, we believe, never reprinted since the commencement of the 18th century. The first 2 have now been published by Messrs. Novello and Company. The Kuhnau influence on Bach seems, however, to have been of short duration, for after these juvenile attempts, as Spitta observes, he never again returned to this branch of music in the whole course of a long artistic career extending over nearly 50 years. The fugue form absorbed nearly the whole attention of that master, and the idea of programme music remained in abeyance until Beethoven revived it a century later. Footnote: See, however, chapter on the predecessors of Beethoven. Emanuel Bach inherited some of his father's genius, and he may instinctively have felt the utter hopelessness of following directly in his footsteps. J.S. Bach had exhausted the possibilities of the fugue form. It was perhaps fortunate for Emanuel Bach that, while still young, he left his father's house. After residing for a few years at Frankfort on the Oder, he entered the service of Frederick the Great, and at the court of that monarch he came, at any rate, directly under Italian influence. An interesting link between Kuhnau and E. Bach is Mattheson, who published at Hamburg in 1713 a sonata dedicated to the one who can best play it, derjenigen Person gewidmet, die sie am besten spielen wird. The work itself not being available, the following description of it by J. Feist, Caecilia, volume 25, page 157, may prove interesting. It, i.e. the sonata, consists of only one movement, which, considering its evidently intentional wealth of technique, might be named a toccata. But in form this one movement clearly belongs to the sonata form, and, in fact, holds a middle place between the tendencies towards sonata form, the term taken in the narrower sense of form of one single movement, noticeable in Kuhnau, and the more developed shape which this form has assumed within recent times. We have here three sections. In the opening one, the theme, after the first exposition in the key of G, forms the basis of various passages, and then appears in the key of the dominant, followed again by passages of larger extent and richer contents. Finally, in abbreviated form, it reappears in the tonic. The second section commences in the parallel key, E minor, with passages which recall those of the first section, and continues with the theme in the same key. Afterwards, theme and passages are developed throughout the keys of A minor, C major, G major, D major and B minor. In the last, in which the theme occurs, there is a full close. As third section, the first is taken da capo. It is evident from a remark made by Mattheson in his Der Willkommene Kapellmeister, which appeared at Hamburg in 1739, that some of the sonatas written during the transition period between Corelli and E. Bach are lost, or at any rate have not been discovered. Mattheson says, "During the last years successful attempts have been made to write sonatas for the clavier, formerly they were for violins or instruments of that kind. Still, up to now, they have not the right form and are capable of being touched, i.e. played, rather than of touching. They aim at the movement of fingers rather than of hearts." A little later than Mattheson, i.e. in 1721, Pier Giuseppe Sardoni, husband of the famous vocalist Cuzzoni, published at London Sonate per il cembalo, dedicated to the Duchess of Pembroke. Number 1 in D minor has three movements, an allemande, largo and giga presto. They are all short and in two sections, and as a rule the writing is in two parts. Number 2 in F opens with an allegro of peculiar form. It has four sections, each of which is repeated. The first, 7 bars, modulates to the key of C, closing thus. The second section, also consisting of 7 bars, soon modulates to D minor, closing in that key in a manner similar to the first. The third section, 10 bars, consists of modulation and slight development, and closes in A minor. The fourth section, 15 bars, passes by means of broken chords, in imitation of the last bar of the previous section, through various keys, ending in the same fashion as the first section. Only, by way probable of the intensification at the end, there are 7 instead of 4 quaver chords. The section, of course, ends in F. This movement in the matter of form offers an interesting link between Kuhnau and E. Bach. The second movement is a minuet with variations. It certainly has a beginning but seems endless. The third sonata in A resembles number 1 in form, also in grouping of movements. And in addition to the sonata of Mattheson, the Sei sonatine per violone e cembalo di Giorgio Filippo Telemann, published at Amsterdam in 1721, will give us an approximate idea of the clavier sonata between Kuhnau and Emanuel Bach. Each number, by the way, is headed, title page notwithstanding, a sonata. Number 1 in A major consists of 4 movements, Adagio, Allegro, Largo, Allegro, and all the 4 are in binary form. The second is naturally the most important, the others are very short and simple. In this Allegro, besides the allusion in the dominant key to the theme at the opening of the second section, there is a return to it after modulation in the principal key. Some of the other sonatas are longer, but number 1 represents, roughly, the other 5 as to form and contents. Number 6 in F, by the way, has only 3 movements, vivace, cantabile and presto. The Sonate per clavicembalo novamente composte, published by Giovanni Battista Preschetti in 1739, deserve notice, since they appeared 3 years before the 6 sonatas dedicated by Emanuel Bach to Frederick the Great. They are 9 in number. In style of writing, order and character of movement they bear the stamp of the period in which they were written. Most of the movements in binary form are of the intermediate type, i.e. they have the principal theme in the dominant at the beginning of the exhibition section and again later on in the principal key. There is considerable variety in the order and number of movements. Number 1, for instance, has an adagio, an allegro and a minuet with variations. Number 2 in D has 4 movements, andante, adagio, allegro, giga. The short adagio is in D minor. Number 3 in G minor, presto and a tempo giusto, a dignified fugue. The influence of Handel is strong, also that of Scarlatti. Bars such as the following foreshadow in a curious manner the Alberti bass. A great number of clavier sonatas were written about the time during which Emanuel Bach flourished. His first sonatas appeared in 1742, his last in 1787. An interesting collection of no less than 72 sonatas, 67 by various composers, 5 anonymous, issued in 12 parts under the title Œuvres mêlées, 12 books, each containing 6 sonatas, was published by Hafner at Würzburg, somewhere between 1760 and 1767, and another collection of symphonies and sonatas, principally by Saxon composers, was published at Leipzig in 1762 under the title Musikalisches Magazin. We will give the names of some of the chief composers, with titles of their works, adding a few other details. It is difficult in some cases to ascertain the year of publication, and it is practically impossible to say when the sonatas were actually composed. Bach, Wilhelm Friedemann, Sei Sonata No. 1. Footnote: the public did not support the undertaking and the other 5 never appeared. End of footnote. D major, Dresden, 1745. Sonata in C, published in Litolf's Maître du Clavecin, and others in D and G autographs, also in F, A and B flat, manuscripts. Bach Johann Ernst, 2 sonatas in Œuvres mêlées. Nickelmann, Christoph, Sei brevi sonate, etc., Opus 2, Nuremberg, between 1745 and 1756. Hasse, 2 sonatas in E flat and B flat, manuscript, on one is the date of 1754. 2 sonatas, one in D minor, only 1 lento movement, the other in D major, only 1 allegro movement in old binary form. These are both in the Leipzig collection named above. Bender, Georg, Sei Sonata, Berlin 1757. Sonatas in G, C minor and G, also 7 sonatinas. Vermischte Klavierstücke, Gotha 1780. Wagenseil, Georg, Sonata, Œuvres mêlées. 6 sonatas for the harpsichord with accompaniment for a violin. Footnote: the copy in the British Museum has no violin part, which was probably unimportant. End of footnote. Opera prima. A. Hummel, London. Schafrath, Christoph. Footnote: Emanuel Bach's predecessor as clavecinist of the Prussian court. End of footnote. 6 sonatas, opus 2, published by Hafner, Nuremberg, 1754. Mozart, Leopold, 3 sonatas, oeuvre mêlée. Mutel, Johann Gottfried, 3 sonatas, etc. Hafner, Nuremberg, about 1753, 3 sonatas, autograph. Umstadt Joseph. Footnote: This name is not in Mendel, Riemann, Grove nor Brown. Fétis, however, mentions him as Joseph Umstadt, maître de chapelle of Count Brühl in Dresden, about the middle of the 18th century and composer of Parthian and of 6 sonatas for the clavecin. End of footnote. 1 sonata, oeuvre mêlée, sonata consisting only of a minuetto, trio and gigue, Leipzig collection, and the 2 Italians, Galuppi, Sonate per cembalo, London, and Paradis P. Domenico, 12 Sonate di clavicembalo, London. Gréty, Belgian composer, 1741 to 1813, wrote Six sonates pour le clavecin, 1768, to which unfortunately we have not been able to gain access. From the 2 collections, etc., may be gathered many facts of interest. First, as regards the number and character of movements in a sonata. Emanuel Bach kept, for the most part, to 3, 2 fast movements divided by a slow one. Footnote: See, however, the early Württemberg sonatas. End of footnote. In the second of his Leipzig collections, 1780, there are 2 with only 2 movements, numbers 2 and 3, a few bars connecting the 2 movements of number 3. But among the other composers there are many examples. In some sonatas the first movement is a slow one, in others both movements are quick, in which case the second one is frequently a minuet. Footnote: Examples to be found in Roller, Müthel and Johann Christian Bach, etc. All 12 sonatas of Paradis have only 2 movements. Of sonatas in 3 movements, some commence with a slow movement followed by 2 quick movements. Footnote: Gluck's 6 sonatas for 2 violins and a thorough bass, published by J. Simpson, London, probably about the time when Gluck was in London, since he is named on the title page Composer to the Opera, have 3 movements, slow, fast, fast, the last generally a minuet. End of footnote. In one instance, in E. Bach's sonatas, the first collection, number 2, in F, we find 2 slow movements followed by a quick one, andante, larghetto, allegro assai. But the greater number had the usual order, allegro or allegretto, andante or adagio, and allegro or presto. Thus Hasse, Nickelmann, Bender and other composers. Now in E. Bach's Württemberg sonatas we found all 3 movements were in the same key, and there are similar cases in Hasse, Friedrich Bach, Johann Ernst Bach, etc., but for the most part the middle, slow movement was in some nearly related key. In a sonata commencing in major, in the relative or tonic minor, or minor under dominant, and even, as in a sonata by Adelgasser, in the upper dominant. Johann C. F. Bach, in one instance, selected the minor key of the upper dominant, and there are examples of more remote keys, E. Bach collection of 1780, No. 1. With sonatas commencing in minor, the key selected for the middle movement was generally the relative major of the under dominant, or that of the tonic, sometimes even tonic major. A very extraordinary example of a remote key is to be met with in Bach's collection of 1779, No. 3. His opening movement is B minor, but his middle one G minor. Footnote: E. Bach did some strange things. One of his sonatas, collection of 1783 No. 1, has the first movement in G major, the second in G minor and the third in E major. End of footnote. It should be mentioned with regard to sonatas in 3 movements commencing in a minor key that the last generally, in the works of this period, remains and ends in minor. In modern sonatas the major is often found, at any rate before the close. See Beethoven, Opus 10, No. 1, etc. Baldassare Galuppi, born in 1706 on the island of Burano, near Venice, was a pupil of Lotti's. Two sets of 6 Sonate per il cembalo of his were published in London. We cannot give the date, but we may state that a sonata of his in manuscript bears the date 1754. Whether of copy or composition is uncertain. Anyhow, the year given acts as limit. The variety in the number of the movements of the published sonatas, one has 4, some have 3, some 2, while number 2 of the first set has only 1, points to a period of transition. This alone, apart from the freshness and charm of the music, entitles them to notice. Much of the writing is thin, only 2 parts, and, technically, the music far less interesting than the Scarlatti pieces. Some of the phrases and figures, and the occasional employment of the Alberti bass, tell, however, of the new era soon about to be inaugurated by Haydn. There is one little feature in the first sonata of the first set which may be mentioned. In the second section of the Adagio, a movement in binary form, of that sonata, the theme appears, as usual then, at the beginning of the second section, and later on reappears in the principal key, but it starts on the 4th instead of the 8th quaver of the bar. There was a great variety in the order of movements. Sometimes a slow movement was followed by 2 quick movements. Galuppi No. 4, first set, Adagio spiritoso, giga allegro. And the third movement was frequently a minuet. The quick movement sometimes came in the middle, Galuppi Sonata in B flat, sometimes at the beginning, E. Bach Collection 1781, No. 3, sometimes at the end, E. Bach Collection 1779, No. 2. Then again, sometimes all, but frequently 2 of the 3 movements were connected, i.e. one passed to the other without break. So much for sonatas in 2 or 3 movements, but among the œuvres mêlées there are no less than 20 which have 4 movements, some in the old order, slow fast, others in a new order, allegro, andante or adagio, minuet, and allegro or presto. Sometimes the last movement was a tempo di menuetto, a polonaise or even a fugue. Thus Wagenseil Wagenseil's Opus 1, sonatas with violin accompaniment, No. 4 in C has allegro, minuetto, adagio and allegro assai. Hupfeld, J. E. Bach, Hengsberger and Kehl. Sometimes, as in Seyffert and Goldberg, the minuet came immediately after the allegro. As this experiment of Seyffert and Goldberg in connection with Beethoven is of special interest, we may add that Goldberg has all the movements in the same key, but Seyffert has both the trio of the minuet and the andante in the underdominant. This occurs in 2 of his sonatas, in both the opening key is major. See Beethoven chapter with regard to position of minuet or scherzo in his sonatas. In a sonata by Schafrath, the opening allegro is followed by a fugue. Again in Spitz, Zach and Fischer, the following order is found: allegro, andante, allegro, minuet. In Fischer all the movements are in one key, only the trio of the minuet is in the tonic minor. In Spitz the andante is in the underdominant, the other movements being in the principal key. In Zach the andante is in the minor tonic, and the third movement in the upper dominant. It is well to notice that in none of these 4 movement sonatas are the movements connected. The same thing is to be observed in Beethoven, with exception, perhaps, for opus 110. In the œuvres mêlées there is only one instance of a sonata in 5 movements by Umstadt. It consists of an allegro, adagio in the dominant, fugue allegro in the relative of the dominant, a minuet in the principal key, with trio in relative minor, and finally a presto. By way of contrast we may recall the 2 sonatas of Hasse in 1 movement, already mentioned, and also the last of Emanuel Bach's 6 sonatas of 1760. The works of many of the composers named in connection with differences in the number and order of movements are forgotten, and in some cases indeed their names are not even thought worthy of a place in musical dictionaries. Yet these variations are of great moment in the history of development. And this for a double reason. First, many of the works must have been known to E. Bach, and yet he seems to have remained, up to the last, faithful to the three movement plan. One or two of his sonatas have only two movements, none however has four. Secondly, the experiment of extending the number to more than three practically passed unheeded by Dussek, Clementi, Mozart. Footnote: there is however one curious exception. The first of the two Sonates pour le clavecin qui peuvent se jouer avec l'accompagnement du violon des idées à Matin Victoire de France par J.J. Wolfgang Mozart de Salzburg, âgé de 7 ans, published at Paris as Opus 1, has four movements, an allegro in C, with, by the way, an Alberti bass from beginning to end, except at the minor chord with organ points near the close of each section, the place for the extemporized cadenza, an andante in F, Alberti bass from beginning to end, a first and second minuet, and an allegro molto, of course, in C. The brief dedication to Opus 1 is signed Votre très humble, très obéissant et très petit serviteur J.J. Wolfgang Mozart. End of footnote. Haydn. Footnote. There is one exception, a sonata in G major, one of his earliest. See chapter on Haydn and Mozart. End of footnote. And by all the composers of importance until Beethoven. The last named commenced with sonatas in four movements, but as will be seen in a later chapter, he afterwards became partial to the scheme of three movements. Let us now consider, and quite briefly, movements in binary form. Again in this matter some instructive facts will be gathered from the facts of Bach's contemporaries. As in Scarlatti, so here we find the first of the two sections into which such a movement is divided, ending in one case, footnote, Scheibe, a return for the moment to a practice which was once of usual occurrence, end of footnote, in the tonic, but as a rule in the dominant. There is, however, an instance of the close in the underdominant, Muthel, No. 2 of the sonatas in 1780, and in E. Bach in the relative minor of the underdominant sonatas of 1780, No. 3 finale. In a minor key, the first section closed either in the key of the relative major or that of the dominant minor. Footnote: mention has been made in this chapter of a first section in a minor piece of Scarlatti's ending in the major key of the dominant. End of footnote. Much more frequently the former. Now, in proportion as the second part of the first section grew more definite, so also did the approach to it. Everyone knows the pause so frequently to be found in Haydn and Mozart on the dominant of the dominant, i.e. if the key of the piece were C. It is instructive to compare the less formal methods of approaching the new key in E. Bach and his contemporary Paradis. With them it was generally by means of a half close. It must be remembered that E. Bach frequently has a movement quite on Scarlatti's line, i.e. without a definitive second subject. Footnote: in the sonatas of 1781, for instance, the first movement of No. 2 in F has a definite second subject, but that is scarcely the case with the first movement of No. 3 in F minor. End of footnote. Also that the second section in Bach's time was, as a rule, of secondary importance. But curiously, in the finale of a sonata written by Leopold Mozart, father of the great genius, after a half cadence on the dominant of the dominants, tempo and measure change from presto 2/4 to andante 3/4, the latter remaining until the end of the first section, and the same occurs in the recapitulation section. By this means the second theme was made specially prominent. In a sonata of Scarlatti's in D commencing there is a definite second subject in, by the way, the minor key of the dominant, and it is divided from the first by two bars in common time, a descending scale and a shake on a semibreve. And then again in No. 12 of the Libro de 12 Sonatas Modernas para Clavicordio, the second subject is divided from the first by 2 bars of common time. The piece is in Scarlatti's favourite measure, 3/8, an ascending scale and a shake. There are clear examples of a second subject besides E. Bach in Eberlin, Fleischer, J. C. Bach and J. C. F. Bach. Yet even in Haydn's sonatas one cannot always speak of a second subject. The further history of the development of the contents of the second half of the first section shows, as it were, a struggle between 2 ideals. One was kinship, i.e. the endeavour to present the secondary matter in strong relationship to the opening one. The opening notes or bars of a real second subject were, indeed, frequently the same, allowance being made of course for difference of key. The other was contrast, i.e. the endeavour to obtain variety. Haydn was more affected by the first, Mozart by the second. In Beethoven the two are happily combined. It is important to notice the closing bars of many first sections of the period of which we are speaking. For instance, in E. Bach, the first movement of the sonata in each of the collections of 1781 and 1783 has a concluding theme, as in the sonata of Scarlatti, and frequently evolved from the opening theme. Though in the complementary key it cannot count as the second subject. It appears after the complementary key has been ushered in by one cadence, and after having apparently run its course, it has been wound up by another. Then, again, the portion between the cadences just mentioned is at times filled with a true theme, so that the concluding one, like the cave of Abraham's field of Machpelah, is in reality an appendency. Sometimes there are several, an enlargement of the exposition section by Beethoven and still more modern composers, so that it contains sometimes 3 or even more themes, is practically an exposition section on Scarlatti lines, only on a larger scale. The figure has become a phrase, mere connected passages have acquired organic meaning. The second section of Scarlatti's movement in binary form contained a few bars of development and modulation. Then a return was made to the opening key of the piece, but never to the opening theme, and in that key a portion more or less great, more or less varied, according to circumstances, was repeated. That return to the opening theme is, as we have already said, the landmark which divides binary from sonata form. In sonatas of the middle of the 18th century the modulation section, in a major key, ended in various ways. On the dominant chord of the principal key, of the tonic chord of the relative minor, the underdominant, or even on the tonic itself of the principal key. Later on Haydn and Mozart kept, for the most part, to the dominant chord. Beethoven, on account of the distant and often abrupt modulations of his middle sections, generally marked the approach to the recapitulation by clear and often prolonged dominant harmony. Sometimes, however, the return of the principal theme comes as a surprise. The recapitulation always remained more or less faithful to the exposition. It is interesting to note how little the character and content of the recapitulation section have been affected in modern times by the growth of the development section. In the matter of balance the 2 sections of movement in binary form are more satisfactory than the 2 sections, 2 so far as the outward division is concerned, of modern sonatas. The grain of mustard seed and the parable grew into a tree, and so likewise have the few bars of modulation of early days grown into an important section. However difficult to detect the exact moment at which a movement in sonata form really ceased to be binary, there seems no doubt that the moment has now passed. We have already noted when the change commenced. End of chapter 1. Recording by Jordan Watts, Oxfordshire.